Alrighty. Well, let's go ahead and look at Hebrews chapter 9. And what we've been doing for the past, shall we say, month is working our way through the first 5 verses of Hebrews chapter 9. We finished chapter 8, which deals really in the problem of the Old Covenant. Right, the issue being that the Old Covenant cannot save, its law cannot save, its promises cannot save. There is no sensibility in which the law or the covenant of Moses can save you or in any way regenerate you. It benefits you, which is ultimately, you can talk about the benefits of the Old Covenant. You can talk about, like Paul in Romans 9 and 10, when he says it benefits the Jewish people to have the covenant. It's not wrong to say that. We are, in fact, glad that they have the testament and the promises, but it brings about no ultimate good, right? You can know the covenant backwards and not be saved, and it profits you nothing. And so there has to be something different. And so he kind of looks at it. In chapter 9, there's a change of tone that you've probably already seen, where he changes subjects to the tabernacle, and he describes all the instruments that are in the tabernacle. We've looked at that pretty extensively so far, that he describes all these items that are in the tabernacle. And I'm just going to read the paragraph because it's been a couple weeks now. So if you look at this paragraph here, right, you have your immediate summary statement, which tells us what he is talking about. The first covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly place of holiness. Okay, so we got the first covenant. It does 2 things. It regulates ministry. And I just, side note, when we did this verse, this word for worship that the ESV has here, most, depending on your translation, might say ministry. That's probably a better translation in this case, just simply because this word is used about priestly worship or priestly ministry. This is a Greek word that implies, it's talking about the Levites and their work and what they do in the tabernacle. And then he describes everything, right? He describes all the stuff. Right? It's got an altar of incense that's golden. It's got a golden urn of manna. It's got Aaron's staff in it. It's got tablets of the covenant in it. It's got the lampstand, the table of the bread of presence. It has all these items that are in the tabernacle. Specifically, what we looked at a few weeks ago, and I've got a little map here that hopefully is helpful, is he's talking about these 2 chambers right here. Okay? So if you look up Exodus 21 down through 28, actually it might be up to 29, those chapters in Exodus 21 through 29 is all of these descriptions about the tabernacle and how it works. And we talk about the lampstand. We think about it as the menorah, right? You see Jewish families who to this day celebrate Yom Kippur, and they use a menorah, right? You'll see it to this day. The 7-headed lampstand, you'll see the table of showbread that's in the tabernacle that is supposed to be replenished on a regular basis as a sign to those who see it that God provided, right? God gave us manna in the wilderness. Then you get to the altar. There's an incense burning altar, and ironically, it is the only one of its kind. Now, there is an altar for burning sacrifices and animals and blood in the front of the tabernacle. That's not described in this text of Hebrews. He's talking about an altar of gold. This altar is made of bronze, and you can look at this in, I want to say, Exodus 22. I'm going to try and stab it there at Exodus 22. The altar of incense is golden, and it is only for incense. And then you get to, of course, the ark itself. And interestingly enough, he records for us 2 other items that are in there. In the holy place, he says it is called the holy place. Okay, the holy place has the lampstand and the table of the bread of the presence. That's the holy place. And behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place. It has a golden altar of incense, has the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold. It has an urn holding manna. It has Aaron's staff that budded, and of course the actual tablets that God wrote on personally. So this tells us a few details that we did not expect. And we looked at this a couple weeks ago, how you can find that one of these in Numbers 17. And Numbers 17 is the story of Korah's rebellion and how God allowed Aaron's staff to quite literally bud with leaves and twigs, and almonds are mentioned there. It's what it budded with. It actually produced fruit. And that was supposed to be, as the actual writing of the text says, as a sign against rebels. And so it was supposed to say God specifically chose Moses and Aaron, those two, by showing you that their staff, or Aaron's staff, budded. And that should be a sign to Korah and his rebellion. They don't make the rules. God decides. God elects his priests. God determines who speaks for him. That's the end of it. It's a warning symbol. And then you have the jar of manna. Jar of manna, I believe, I'm going to say, is recorded in Exodus 28, where there's just a very small paragraph. It's just a couple verses. It's very minute. You miss it most of the time you read Exodus. At the end of the manna story, when it's stated that God provided manna, and he gives them the instructions about manna. On the seventh day, don't take any. On the sixth day, take double, so that you have enough, etc., etc. At the very end, there's a little section that says, and put some in an urn and place it before the Ark of the Covenant. And so we know that's in there. So there's these three items, okay, that sit with the Ark and the tablets. But that's not the end of it, because above it, okay, so you got the tablets, you have Aaron's staff, and you have this jar of manna, and above that are the cherubim of glory, overshadowing the mercy seat. And he speaks on these. I'm going to stop here and just look at these particular items. So you have the incense, okay? You look at the incense altar. It is designed to bring the sweet smell to God behind the curtain. So if you even look at it geographically, it sits right here. Here's where the incense is burned. It sits in front of this curtain right here. The idea then being that the smoke that the incense gives off flows through the fabric of the curtain, right? It can sift through the curtain. So the curtain serves a double purpose. One, it's a wall, right? You can't get in there. You are not supposed to see Yahweh sitting on the mercy seat. However, he can still smell the incense and the offerings that come from this section here, right? He still has access to this section, but you don't have access to him. So the incense is burned. It serves as a sweet smell to the Lord. We have the tablets of the law, and you kind of have the very etymology of the Ark of the Covenant itself, which is what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to try and I forgot thought I had a picture here, but you have, right, when you go in there, and it's described in detail. We looked at this last week. There's a mercy seat, okay? It's described just so. There's a seat of mercy that is on top of the lid of the ark. Now, between, or I should say on either side of the mercy seat, are the cherubim. And you've probably seen this in Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade, which one is it where he's got the ark and it melts everybody? This is the first one, yeah. Where they actually there's little depictions, right, of the ark, and there you go. And there's a seat in the center, and there's two angels on either side, and they sit over the seat itself. Those are the angels, the cherubim. They sit on or next to, on each side of the mercy seat with their wings outstretched over it. So you kind of have this picture, hopefully, that begins to take shape, where you have the law. When you go into that Holy of Holies as Aaron to do your job, the first thing you see is the law, right? And he sits on the law. The very nature of the fact that you can have access to God at all depends upon the fact that he sits on and over the covenant that he made with you, right? You have access to God because he made a covenant with you, and that's the first thing you see when you enter his presence, right? Without law and without covenant, there is no relationship with God. If God is holy and he's sinless, and he wants to have a relationship with sinful human beings, at some point, someone has to establish an agreement, right? And it's clearly God. You're not going to establish it. He is, but he makes it clear that here's the box upon which the law is dictated, and it sits in, and then he sits over it, okay? The relationship is built upon the law and the covenant. Then it's called the mercy seat, okay? Which is supposed to be kind of a little bit ironic, right? That you have the law, which is not merciful at all, right? The purpose of the law is justice. And then on top of that is the mercy of God. And God himself sits between two, the word is very specific, cherubim. And you have it right here, and we're going to translate it. And this is a very specific word. So I'm just going to translate verse 5 firstly, And then I'm going to translate verses 6 and 7 when we have time and as a much larger section. So here is verse 5:5 of Hebrews chapter 9, or excuse me, 9:5, not 5:5. So you have huperano. This is just a preposition over or above. Just a simple preposition. De, which is but, and then, this is in Greek, so in English we would probably say but above. Ialtes, this. Notice the capital letter, capital key here. Cherubim. Cherubim. This is the cherubim. This is a direct transliteration. Doxes. Glorious or of glory. They're glorious in some regard. So you have that. Then you have this big verb here. Kata skianta. So this is like to look over. Skianos is darkness, so kata is like creating darkness upon. So the idea is like it's shadowing over something, over or covering up. That would be a good translation. Covering up. This is fascinating. Ta, the, and you just have one noun right here, one word. Elasteon. This is like this is the atonement or propitiation. And you probably have mercy seat written in most of your translations, right? They're over the mercy seat. And that's true, right? Clearly, he's talking about two specific cherubim that are supposed to be situated over the mercy seat. That's not the word he uses, though. The word he uses is over the atonement. The cherubim cover the atonement, the propitiation. Okay? And then you have a period. And then peri is about this or because of this. About this, second line, which not, uk is a negative particle, not estin, it is, noon is now or right now, lagain, saying or speaking, saying, katameras, according to the parts. So this is an awkward translation here. This is a little bit more difficult to understand. So we'll look at that here in just a minute. But what I'm chiefly interested in at the moment is the cherubim, okay? Because this is a very unusual word. This word is only used here in the entire New Testament. Now you'll see angel everywhere. Angelos is used all over the New Testament, but cherubim only shows up here. This is its only use in Greek. So if we want to figure this out, we have to do a couple things. One of the first things that we have to do is go to its Hebrew root, because we can see this is clearly a transliteration. He's talking about a Hebrew word, and actually, just as a complete etymological side note, we know that because, if I can find it here, so the way Hebrew works is im on the end of a word is plural. That's how you pluralize something. So Elohim with im on the end of it is technically translated gods. We would technically translate the name Elohim as gods. It's a reference to the Godhead. Seraphim, if you ever heard of the seraphim, right? In Isaiah 6, I want to say, the burning ones, right? There's lots of them. There's multiples. There's seraph, they're burning, but there's a lot of them. So seraphim, the burning ones. Cherubim is plural. He's talking about a number here. There's more than one, and it comes from the Hebrew word cheruv. And I think I have it written up here somewhere. Here we go, if you can see that. Actually, this would technically be keruv. There is no soft ch in Hebrew. It's just keruv, the keruv. But of course, in plural, it would be keruvim. So this is that word. Direct transliteration. It has a very uncertain origin. You can look up lexicons and Strongs and Thayers and all kinds of Greek and Hebrew interlinear translations, and you will find that nowhere is this word have a root. I'm going to explain why that's unusual. Almost everything else in Hebrew has a root meaning, and I'll explain this through Adam. The word Adam is the word for man, mankind. Adam is man, right? You can think of that from Genesis 1 and 2. Adam is just the basic word for man or mankind in ancient Hebrew. Ironically, it comes from the word Adah. Adah means red. It's the color red. which is fascinating. So it's interesting enough to consider that apparently the original color of man is red, or very red colored, or that was the color at least that they associated with mankind from Moses' time, is that man is a reddish color. Cherub or seraphim, the burning ones from Isaiah 6, where Isaiah sees the throne of God. Seraph means to burn. Literally talking about fire. Seraph is fire. Fiery ones. Burning ones. So he's speaking of the specific people that are on fire. They're burning actively. However, cherub means nothing. It has no root at all. This word just appeared out of thin air when Moses wrote it down in 1500 BC. It was not part of the Hebrew language prior to Moses recording Genesis and Exodus. This is a unique word that God specifically designed and gave to Moses to describe someone specific. Okay? This word has no other context whatsoever. It has no roots. It has no cognates. It has nothing else with which we can translate or transliterate some kind of meaning out of it. It's just simply exists by itself. It's talking about someone. It's a name, or some kind of specific designation of specific angels of some sort. Has no underlying roots whatsoever. And the first mention of it that we have is Exodus 26. Actually, I'm wrong. I'm incorrect. The first mention of cherubim is Genesis 3. At the very end of Genesis 3, you will find the word cheruv or keruv in Hebrew when at the very end of the interaction of Adam and Eve and the snake, the Lord casts them out of the garden, and he says, and he installed a cherubim with a flaming sword to guard the tree of life. And it's not the word angel, it is the word cherubim. There's a specific type of angel that is set, and apparently fairly militarized, prepared to hurt somebody if they came to get the tree of life, specifically to ward them off. And the next mention you'll have of cherub or cherubim is in Exodus 26. And this is the ones we're thinking of, right? You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, and a cubit hath its breadth. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Of hammered work you shall make them on the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub for one end, and 1 cherub for the other end. Of one piece with the mercy seat you shall make the cherubim on its 2 ends. So we kind of almost have this picture of the gilded overlay of the top of the ark has a seat on it where God himself sits, and melded onto it, it's all one piece, it's melded onto the top, are 2 cherubims whose wings spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, their faces to one another. Towards the mercy seat shall the faces of the cherubim be. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I shall give you. Okay, so the design is in place, right? It's a box. Within the box are maintained the laws, and then on top of the box, God himself sits on a seat, and 2 cherubim effectively overshadow what they see. Or actually, they look at each other. They don't even look directly at the mercy seat. They look at one another across the mercy seat. So we have a very specific designation here. And we are operating based on the premise, and we've done this for a couple weeks now, that God does not design at random, right? God does not just build gilded nice things to look good. There's a reason that God has a certain what R.C. Sproul says is an economy to his construction, that he builds things the way he builds them for very specific reasons. This is not designed just to be elaborate for elaborate's sake. This is supposed to send a message, okay? The law is pretty clear enough. He gives them actual tablets of stone and puts them in a box to give a message, which is what? You made a covenant with me, right? Every time Aaron sees that box, he should know God's literal handwritten agreement that he made with us is in that box right there in front of me. There's no denying it, right? Every time he sees the mercy seat, he should know God sits on that seat and is there to mediate with him. So what message did the cherubim communicate? And I want us to think typologically here, right? All of this elaborate stuff, right? The lampstand, the bread of the presence, the golden altar of incense, all of it is not supposed to be an end in and of itself, right? This covenant was not designed to last. This tabernacle was not designed to last. This covenant was not designed to last, right? They were designed to be replaced. Every one of them. This menorah and this lampstand, this bread of the presence and the tabernacle and the sacrifices and the blood of the animals, all that was all designed to be temporary, right? Every bit of it. So what we are operating on is the premise that I'm arguing theologically that all of this is one giant type of Christ to come. Right, every bit of it, down to the cherubim, down to the menorah, down to the bread of the presence, all of it is just an intermediary shadow of something better that's coming down the pipeline. And that's the opposite of Jewish thinking, right? That's the opposite of the Hebrews thinking. They want this tabernacle to last forever. That's their thoughts, right? They're convinced it should go on forever and ever and ever. That's why they build temples instead of tabernacles. The tabernacle is temporary. It's a tent. You can pick it up and move it somewhere else. Temples don't move. Right, and they built temples, and in AD 70 they got torn down. But all that being said is that all of this points to Christ. So the question I want to ask is, why cherubim? How does that point to Christ? Okay, and we don't have a lot of data to go on to know this because they're mentioned very sparsely. I believe the total times is, I think it's 16 times. I might check that before we quit here tonight. But 16 times the word cherubim comes up in the Old Testament. That's not a lot. That's a pretty sparse rendering. And ironically, 10 of them, of its 16 uses, show up in Ezekiel. And that's fascinating. Here's Thayer's lexicon. He says, cherubim, the two golden figures of living creatures with two wings. They were fastened to the lid of the Ark of the Covenant by the Holy of Holies, both of the sacred tabernacle and Solomon's temple, in such a manner that their faces are torn towards each other and down toward the lid, and they overshadow with expanded wings. Between these figures, God was regarded as having fixed his dwelling place. And then he says in Ezekiel, another far more elaborate form is described to them, but the author of the Epistle of Hebrews certainly has Exodus 25 in mind. I'm not going to look at this tonight. This is excellent reading material that I would highly recommend, but it's kind of outside of the scope of what I'm trying to accomplish tonight. But I would encourage you to go look at Ezekiel chapter 10. It has a very large description of the cherubim and gives us a great more details. And there's a great deal of debate as to what these creatures are in theological circles, even if they're even to be related in the same category as angels per se. We could be talking about something entirely different. We know for a fact at least Isaiah saw a type of angel, one type that had 6 wings, right, which is described as 2 over his feet, 2 he flies with, and 2 he covers his eyes with, right? So there's at least one specific type of angel. Every description that we have of angels dealing with man, such as in Jesus' tomb, as for all intents and purposes, we believe them to be human-like. We had no reason to assume otherwise from the text. So we could get into a great deal of spiritual, shall we say, heterodoxy, which is speculation off-center. But my goal is not necessarily to describe what they are. My goal today is to describe why they are Christological in nature. And if you look up the word cherubim and its various 16 uses across the Old Testament, it's used once in Exodus, it's used once in Genesis, it's used about 10 different times in Ezekiel, but by far the majority of other times that you will find this word is almost in passing. You almost miss it. And you begin to see a pattern if you look at all of its other uses across the Old Testament, and hopefully this pattern clues us in. It's used in 1 Samuel 4:4. This is David when he gets the ark back from the Philistines. Okay, the ark has been imprisoned by the Philistines, and he made a deal and he got it back. So the people sent to Shiloh and brought there from the Ark of the Covenant the Lord of Hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. Okay, interesting. The Ark is described as the Lord of Hosts, who is enthroned with the cherubim. 2 Kings 19. Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Lord God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim. You are God. You alone, you are kings of all the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Very eschatological prayer from Hezekiah, right? This is if you look at not Exodus, 2 Kings 19, Hezekiah is praying to the Lord for deliverance from the Assyrians. And he prays to the one who sits above the cherubim. Psalm 80, give ear, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock, you who are enthroned upon the cherubim, shine forth. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble, he sits enthroned upon the cherubim. The Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim. This is Isaiah. You are God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth. Hopefully you see a pattern. The cherubim almost mentioned in passing, except for a couple instances, or specifically in one chapter in Ezekiel, which is a singular case, the cherubim are almost a passing thought to the main thought, which is that they serve as the throne, or shall we say, the enthronement of someone great. Right? The Lord of hosts sits above the cherubim. Right? The goal is not the cherubim for Hezekiah or David or any of these guys. The goal is not the angels themselves. The goal is who sits there, who sits between them, right? In the Ark of the Covenant, or at the Ark of the Covenant in the mercy seat. And we know this to be the Lord of hosts. In other words, what I'm arguing is the Christological nature of the cherubim is that they are designed to glorify Christ, right? That's their goal. It's a glorious thing, Hezekiah says, that he is the God who's enthroned. He sits between them, right? He sits between them. He reigns. Let the people tremble. He is enthroned above them. Let the earth quake. You are the God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth, because you're enthroned by the cherubim. It's a symbol of not the status of the cherubim, of the status of God, who sits there between them. In other words, what you're dealing with is creatures who are so glorious and who are so majestic. However, they are subservient to someone else. What makes the Lord as glorious inherently is not just his inherent glory, but the fact that the cherubim, who are pretty glorious, glorify him, right? That he's enthroned among them. It's supposed to be a statement of the glory of God, of his mercy. So what I'm arguing is the mercy of God and his willingness to have relationship with fallen man is glorious. The fact that he sits on the mercy seat and does business with Aaron at all in the tabernacle from between the cherubim is a stooping down to the mercy seat. The fact that the cherubim worship him and yet Aaron has access to that seat is in and of itself glorious. Does that make sense? In other words, there's a grace and a measure of mercy that is infinite that we don't even understand, where God, who is inherently worshipped by the cherubim and the seraphim and all the angels, much better creatures than us, by far, right? No contest. That same God is the God who sits on that seat and deals with Aaron. There's a statement of contrast there. There's a statement of the ultimate grace of God. It is a merciful seat, not because the law is merciful, but because he is merciful to sit there with you at all, right? Cherubim worship this God, right? And they're pretty fantastic. They're not even described in great detail, except in Ezekiel 10, but they're left very ambiguous in their glory. Those same angels worship God, and he is here sitting in front of you on this seat, right? It's a statement of the power and might of God. It forces humanity to remember its place. It forces us to not think nearly as highly of ourselves. It forces Aaron to be humble when he goes behind that curtain, right? He realizes that angels worship this God. Now, very quickly, that is the summary statement that I'm making for the doctrine of the cherubim. It is worth noting, I'm just going to note very quickly, he notes at the very end of verse 5, about which not it is now we say according to the parts. It's kind of an awkward statement there. We render it pretty weirdly in English. But in other words, he's saying we're not going to speak right now about all the parts of the tabernacle. In other words, his goal right now is not necessarily to be exhaustive. The writer of Hebrews isn't interested in writing an entire commentary on the tabernacle. That's not his goal. His goal right now, his goal is simply to indicate what he wants to indicate about the tabernacle. So this kind of plays into the fact that some of the details, some commentators note that some of the details are off, like the incense altar, which I know we talked about extensively a couple of weeks ago, how it's stated as being in the holy and not the holy of holies. That's because the authors here, his intent and his goal is not necessarily to be exhaustive in nature about the tabernacle. His goal is to make a point about the Christology of the tabernacle. And we know that because of what he says next. One commentator says, besides what had met the eye in the sanctuary, there were spiritual realities symbolized which would take too long to discuss in detail, our chief subject at present being the priesthood and the sacrifices, which not merely refers to the cherubim, but to all the contents of the sanctuary enumerated. In other words, this is just kind of a summary catch-all phrase. The author is saying, I've talked to you about this menorah and this table of showbread and the cherubim. I'm not here to talk about all the parts. What I'm here chiefly to talk about is their summary, which I will translate at the risk of running a little bit over, but hopefully not too much. In verse 6. I'll just translate verse 6. I have 6 and 7 here on the board, but I'm not going to translate both 6 and 7. We're not going to be able to do that tonight. But I will translate verse 6. So we have, this is two tones, so this is plural. These, but, you have your little preposition word there. Let me make this a little bit smaller so I can make it fit. But these, iautus, in this way, or thus, and you have a big old verb right here, kates kuos menon, kates kuos menon. This is a participle, so this is like, this would be preparing, but this is past tense. So this would be like having been prepared, or been prepared. Something's been set up, something's been set in place. Unto, eis men tein protein. Unto, or to, the first. Men is first, so actually, if we were going to be very wooden in Greek, first the protein, beginning skene, tent. Unto the first tent. And you have what's in the first tent. Dia pantos, through all, easin, this would be they entered or went in. Entered hoi eres, the priests. Eres is priests. This is plural. Many priests, more than one. Tas latreos epiteluntes. So this is the ministries. Plural. Epiluntes, they finish or they complete. Oops. See if I can get this to fit a little bit better. Ace de tain deuteron. So we'd say, but to the second. This Deuteros is the second. Deuteronomy is the second book of law, for reference. Apox to epeotu. So this is once or one time. The epiratu is year. It's literally 365 days. Monos, alone. The arche Arius. So you have Arius, and you have Arius, you have arche Arius, the high priest, the top priest. The high priest, u choris hemiatos, so not without hemiatos, blood. You ever heard of a hemiologist? A hemiologist studies blood. Hemas is the Greek word for blood. This is hemiatos. Ha prospere, which he carries or brings, huper, on behalf of, let me make this big, huper is on behalf of, iautu, himself, kai, and ton to leo, all the people. Leo is people, nation. Ag noe maton, mistakes, shortcomings. Note that I did not use the word for sin. This is a different word, and that matters. Here in just a minute. So, you got a big old section of scripture here. It's all kind of one big sentence. I'm going to do a little bit of it, and then we'll be done. A couple things are made clear from this passage, right? We're changing paragraphs, for one. Verse 5 down through verse 6 and 7 begin a new paragraph. Verses 1 through 5 of Hebrews 9 describe the tabernacle, describes all these instruments and artifacts that are in the tabernacle, describes the fact that all of these instruments have a specific place. Then you get to verse 6, and thus they have been prepared. Okay? These objects, these artifacts had to be prepared, right? The menorah had to be prepared. The table of the bread had to be prepared, and we know this because it was a traveling temple, right? The tabernacle was designed to be picked up and moved somewhere else. For 40 years, they wandered around, and they had a tent with them, and they would move from place to place, and they would set it up as they went. So every time that you make camp, you have to set up the tabernacle, right? And you have to prepare all these things, and you have the first tent into which all the priests minister, right? Everybody's allowed to go in the first tent with the menorah and the showbread. This is not an area specific only to the high priest. The Levites can go in the first section. But the second section, one time a year, the high priest alone goes into. No one goes into the Holy of Holies, where the ark sits, without being the high priest and without a very specific duty that he must accomplish. And what is that? It's the duty of blood. He can't go there without blood. A high priest who goes back there without blood of animals has broken covenant with God, right? He cannot do it, which he carries for two reasons: for himself and for the people's shortcomings. Now, we're talking about something very specific, aren't we? We're talking about the Day of Atonement. We're talking about Yom Kippur, which is what the modern-day Jewish culture would call it. It is one of the very specific yearly events in the Jewish calendar. It is roughly, I read it and I forgot it now. I forget what time of year it is, but it's, I think I want to say early fall. I want to say it's like July, August, something like that. When Yom Kippur is celebrated. Doesn't matter, because it's described for us in great detail in Leviticus. So you can read bits and pieces of the Day of Atonement in Exodus, but the Day of Atonement is laid out very specifically in Leviticus 16. Okay? If you want to find precise instructions on what the Day of Atonement involved, it was described for the Levites, right? The book of Leviticus being the book of the Levites, right? This is their priestly laws. And in chapter 16, very specific instructions are laid out. And I'm going to read just some of them here, and then I guess we'll do the rest next week. But the Levites in the Day of Atonement have a very specific job, and Aaron has a very specific job. In this entire chapter, 28 verses of very precise instructions are laid out for Aaron to do. And I will summarize briefly. We'll do this again next week, but I'll summarize briefly what some of these things are. Note that it says, in the very opening of Leviticus 16, tell your brother, Aaron, not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so he may not die. Except, for I will appear in a cloud over the mercy seat, but in this way he shall come into the holy place. Okay, so we only have the instructions. Here's how Aaron's allowed into the holy place. A, he has to have a bull. Okay, 2, he has to have a ram. One for a sin offering, one for a burnt offering. Note, interestingly, that the bull is the sin offering. Interesting side note, the bull would be by far the more expensive. Cattle are expensive in ancient times. Cattle are a very nice luxury to have. Rams are good. Rams are good stuff, livestock to have, but definitely cattle. Cattle are ironically more expensive in the Middle East because they're harder to maintain. There's not as much grazing area for them to subsist on, and not as much flat terrain for cattle to graze on. If you got cattle, you're wealthy. Aaron has to take the most expensive animal and slaughter that one for his sins and the sins of his family, which we're going to look at here in just a minute. And then he has to put on very specific garments. Right, he puts on his coat and the linen undergarment and the linen sash around his waist and the turban. I believe we looked at this a while ago, how the high priest has very specific garments that he is dedicated to wear. He has to put that on. He has to wash himself. And then he's got a bull, he's got a ram, and he's got 2 male goats for a sin offering, specifically. Okay? The ram is the only object here that is the burnt offering, that is just designed to please the Lord. Everything else is for sin. 2 male goats and a bull. And then we have what happens. So Aaron offers the bull for himself and to make atonement for himself and his house. Okay? Aaron has to do one job first. He cannot enter the Holy of Holies while he's a sinner. Right? He can't be there while he himself is unclean and his house is unclean before he can even begin the process of atonement. He has to be he himself clean. And by that, he has to be washed, he has to be atoned for, and he has to wear the holy garments. Okay? Then he's allowed to actually begin atoning. Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 goats. Okay? One for the Lord and the other for Azazel. We don't have a lot of info on this word. This is kind of another interesting just etymological side note. This word just also appears in Hebrew. It had no other roots to it. It's kind of assumed from the context to just mean like the wilderness, the outcasts, the nowhere. Azazel is like the hateful barren land, the desert, the place that's unfriendly. In other words, you're sending the goat out to die in the wilderness. That's the goal. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell to the Lord as a sin offering. The goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent into the wilderness to Azazel. So, you know what? I'm going to stop there because this gets much more complicated when we start talking about precision of what each blood goes where. And we're talking about very specific objects now. We're talking about blood being sprinkled on very specific altars a number of times. It has to be sprinkled on the mercy seat and in front of it a number of times. And then, and only then, is the goat allowed to go into the wilderness. So we'll stop there for now because I don't want to drag this out too much, and we'll just have to resume next week.